Memoirs of the Reverend Brainerd, written by Jonathan Edwards. This is being read by Peter John Paresis, also known as Brian Dean. These are free audio recordings. You may make as many copies as you desire. More copies of free audios and books on prayer and caustics can be found on the website www.intheschoolofprayer.com. Picking up on chapter 5, from the commencement of his labors at Missionary to his ordination. Quote, April 1st, 1743. I rode to Missionary, near 20 miles from Stockbridge, where the Indians live, with whom I am concerned, and there lodged on a little heap of straw. I was greatly exercised with inward trials and distresses all day, and in the evening my heart was sunk, and I seemed to have no God to go to. Oh, that God would help me, unquote. The next 5 days he was in the most part in a dejected, depressed state of mind, and sometimes extremely so. He speaks of God's, quote, waves and billows rolling over his soul, unquote, and of his being ready sometimes to say, quote, surely his mercy is clean gone forever, and he will be favorable no more, and says the anguish he endured was nameless and inconceivable, but at the same time speaks thus concerning his distresses, quote, what God designs for all my distresses I know not, but this I know I deserve them all, and thousands more, unquote. He gives an account of the Indians kindly receiving him and being seriously attentive to his instructions. Quote, April 7th. Appeared to myself exceedingly ignorant, weak, helpless, unworthy, and altogether unequal to my work. It seems to me that I should never do any service or have any success among the Indians. My soul was weary of my life. I longed for death beyond measure. When I thought of any godly soul departed, my soul was ready to envy him his privilege, thinking, quote, oh, when will my turn come? Must it be years first, unquote? But I know these ardent desires, at this and other times, rose partly for want of resignation to God under all miseries, and so were but impatiency. Towards night, I had the exercise of faith and prayer, and some assistance in writing. Oh, that God would keep me near him. April the 8th. Was exceedingly pressed under a sense of my pride, selfishness, bitterness, and party spirit in times past, while I attempted to promote the cause of God. Its vile nature and dreadful consequences appeared in such odious colors to me that my very heart was pained. I saw how poor souls stumbled over it into everlasting destruction, that I was constrained to make that prayer in the bitterness of my soul, quote, O Lord, deliver me from blood guiltiness, unquote. I saw my desert of hell on this account. My soul was full of inward anguish and shame before God, that I had spent so much time in conversation tending only to promote a party spirit. I saw that I had not suitably prized mortification, self-denial, resignation under all adversities, meekness, love, candor, and holiness of heart and life, and this day was almost wholly spent in such bitter and soul-afflicting reflections on my past frame and conduct. Of late, I have thought much of how having the kingdom of God advanced in the world, but now I saw I had enough to do within myself. O Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner, and wash my soul. April the 9th. Remained much in the same state as yesterday, excepting that the state of my vileness was not so quick and acute. Lord's Day, April 10th. Rose early in the morning and walked out and spent a considerable time in the woods in prayer and meditation. Preached to the Indians both forenoon and afternoon. They behaved soberly in general. 2 or 3 in particular appeared under some religious concern, with whom I discoursed privately, and one told me, quote, that her heart had cried, ever since she had heard me preach first." Unquote. The next day, he complains of much desertion. Quote, April 12th, "Was greatly oppressed with grief and shame, reflecting on my past conduct, my bitterness and party zeal. I was ashamed to think that such a wretch as I had ever preached, longed to be excused from that work, and when my soul was not in anguish and keen distress, quote, I felt senseless as a beast before God, unquote, and felt a kind of guilty amusement with the least trifles, which still maintain a kind of stifled horror of conscience, so that I could not rest any more than a condemned malefactor." April 13th. "My soul was overwhelmed within me. I verily thought that I was the meanest, vilest, most helpless, guilty, ignorant, benighted creature living, and yet I knew what God had done for my soul at the same time. Though sometimes I was assaulted with dampening fears and doubts, whether it was possible for such a wretch as I to be in a state of grace." April 14th. "Remained much in the same state as yesterday." April 15th. "In the forenoon, very disconsolated. In the afternoon, preached to my people, and was a little encouraged in some hopes that God might bestow mercy on their souls. Felt somewhat resigned to God under all dispensations of His providence." April 16th. "Still in the depths of distress. In the afternoon, preached to my people, but was more discouraged with them than before. Feared that nothing would ever be done for them to any happy effect. I retired and poured out my soul to God for mercy, but without any sensible relief. Soon after came an Irishman and a Dutchman with the design, as they said, to hear me preach the next day, but none can tell how I felt to hear their profane talk. Oh, I longed that some dear Christian knew my distress. I got into a kind of hovel, and there groaned out my complaint to God, and withal felt more sensible gratitude and thankfulness to God that He had made me to differ from these men, as I knew through grace He had." Lord's Day, April 17th. "In the morning was again distressed as soon as I awakened. Hearing much talk about the world and the things of it, I perceived that the men were in some measure afraid of me, and I discoursed about sanctifying the Sabbath, if possible to sodomize their mind. But when they were at a little distance, they again talked freely about secular affairs. Oh, I thought what a hell it would be to live with such men to eternity. The Lord gave me some assistance in preaching all day, and some resignation, and a small degree of comfort in prayer at night." Unquote. He continued in this disconsolate frame the next day. Quote, April 19th. "In the morning I enjoyed some sweet repose and rest in God, felt some strength and confidence in Him, and my soul was in some measure refreshed and comforted. Spent most of the day in writing and had some exercise of grace, sensible and comfortable. My soul seemed lifted above the deep waters wherein it has been so long almost drowned. Felt some spiritual longings and breathings of soul after God, and found myself engaged for the advancement of Christ's kingdom in my own soul." April 20th. "Set apart this day for fasting and prayer, to bow my soul before God for the bestowment of divine grace, especially that all my spiritual afflictions and inward distresses might be sanctified to my soul, and endeavored also to remember the goodness of God to me the year past, this day being my birthday. Having obtained help of God, I have hitherto lived, and am now arrived at the age of 25 years. My soul was pained to think of my barrenness and deadness, that I have lived so little to the glory of the eternal God. I spent the day in the woods alone, and there poured out my complaint to God. Oh, that God would enable me to live to His glory for the future." April 21st. Spent the forenoon in reading and prayer, and found myself engaged, but still much depressed in spirit under a sense of my vileness and unfitness for any public service. In the afternoon, I visited my people and prayed, and conversed with some about their soul's concerns, and afterwards found some ardor of soul in secret prayer. or that I might grow up into the likeness of God. April 22nd, spent the day in study, reading, and prayer, and felt a little relieved of my burden that has been so heavy of late, but still was in some measure oppressed, and had a sense of barrenness. All my leanness testifies against me. My very soul abhors itself for its unkindness, unlikeness to God, its inability and sluggishness. When I have done all, alas, what an unprofitable servant am I. My soul groans to see the hours of the day roll away, because I do not fill them in spirituality and heavenly mindedness, and yet I long that they should speed their pace to hasten me to my eternal home, while I may fill up all my moments through eternity for God and His glory. Unquote. On Saturday and Lord's Day, his melancholy again prevailed. He complained of his ignorance, stupidity, and senselessness, while yet he seems to have spent the time with the utmost diligence in study, in prayer, in instructing and counseling the Indians. On Monday, he sank into the deepest melancholy, so that he supposed he never spent a day in such distress in his life, not in fears of hell, which he says he had no pressing fear of, but a distressing sense of his own vileness, etc. On Tuesday, he expresses some relief. Wednesday, he kept as a day of fasting and prayer, but in great distress. The 3 days next following, his melancholy continued, but in a less degree, and with intervals of comfort. On the last of these days, he wrote the following letter to his brother John, then a student at Yale College, New Haven. Kanawhanami, April 30th, 1743. Dear brother, I should tell you, I long to see you, but my own experience has taught me that there is no happiness and penury satisfaction to be enjoyed in earthly friends, though ever so near and dear, or in any other enjoyment. That is not God Himself. Therefore, if the God of all grace be pleased, graciously, to afford us each His presence and grace, that we may perform the work, endure the trials He calls us to, and the most distressing, tiresome wilderness, till we arrive at our journey's end, the local distance at which we are held from each other at present is a matter of no great moment or importance to either of us. But alas, the presence of God is what I want. I live in the most lonely, melancholy desert, about 18 miles from Albany, for it was not thought best that I should go to Delaware River, as I believe I hinted to you in a letter from New York. I board with a poor Scotsman. His wife can talk scarce any English. My diet consists mostly of hasty pudding, boiled corn, and bread baked in the ashes, and sometimes a little meat and butter. My lodging is a little heap of straw, laid upon some boards, a little way from the ground, for it is a log room, without any floor, that I lodge in. My work is extremely and exceedingly hard and difficult. I travel on foot 1.5 miles, the worst of ways, almost daily, and back again, for I live so far from my Indians. I have not seen an English person this month. These and many other circumstances, equally uncomfortable, attend me, and yet my spiritual conflicts and distresses so far exceed all these that I scarce think of them, or hardly observe that I am not entertained in the most sumptuous manner. The Lord grant that I may learn to, quote, endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ, unquote. As to my success here, I cannot say much as yet. The Indians seem generally kind and well disposed towards me, are mostly very attentive to my instructions, and seem willing to be taught further. 2 or 3, I hope, are under some convictions, but there seems to be little of the special workings of the divine Spirit among them yet, which gives me many a heart-sinking hour. Sometimes I hope that God has abundant blessings in store for them and me, but at other times I am so overwhelmed with distress that I cannot see how His dealings with me are consistent with covenant love and faithfulness, and I say, quote, surely His tender mercies are clean gone forever, unquote. But, however, I see that I needed all this chastisement already. Quote, It is good for me, unquote, that I have endured these trials and have hitherto little or no apparent success. Do not be discouraged by my distresses. I was under great distress at Mr. Pomeroy's when I saw you last, but, quote, God has been with me of a truth, unquote, since that he helped me sometimes sweetly at Long Island and elsewhere. But let us always remember that we must, through much tribulation, enter in God's eternal kingdom of rest and peace. The righteous are scarcely saved. It is an infinite wonder that we have well-grounded hopes of being saved at all. For my part, I feel the most vile of all creatures living, and I am sure sometimes there is not such another existing on this side hell. Now all you can do for me is to pray incessantly that God would make me humble, holy, resigned, and heavenly minded by all my trials. Quote, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might, unquote. Let us run, wrestle, and fight, that we may win the prize and obtain that complete happiness to be, quote, holy as God is holy, unquote. So wishing and praying that you may advance in learning and grace and be fit for special service for God, I remain your affectionate brother, David Brainerd. Quote, Lord's Day, May 1st. Was at Stockbridge today. In the forenoon had some little relief and assistance, though not so much as usual. In the afternoon felt poorly in body and soul while I was preaching. Seemed to be rehearsing idle tales without the least life, fever, sense, or comfort. And especially afterwards at the sacrament, my soul was filled with confusion and the utmost anguish that ever I endured under the feeling of my inexpressible vileness and meanness. It was a most bitter and distressing season to me, by reason of the view I had of my own heart and the secret abominations that lurked there. I thought that the eyes of all in the house were upon me, and I dared not look anyone in the face, for it verily seemed as if they saw the vileness of my heart and all the sins I had ever been guilty of. And if I had been banished from the presence of all mankind, never to be seen any more, or so much as thought of, still I should have been distressed with shame, and I should have been ashamed to see the most barbarous people on earth, because I was viler, and seemingly more brutishly ignorant than they. Quote, I am made to possess the sins of my youth, unquote. The remaining days of this week were spent, for the most part, in inward distress and gloominess. The next Sabbath he had encouragement, assistance, and comfort, but on Monday sunk again. Quote, May 10th was in the same state as to my mind that I had been in for some time, extremely oppressed with a sense of guilt, pollution, and blindness. Quote, the iniquity of my heels had compassed me about. The sins of my youth have been set in order before me. They have gone over my head as a heavy burden, too heavy for me to bear, unquote. Almost all the actions of my life past seem to be covered over with sin and guilt, and those of them that I performed in the most conscious manner now fill me with shame and confusion, that I cannot hold up my face. Oh, the pride, selfishness, hypocrisy, ignorancy, bitterness, party zeal, and the want of love, candor, meekness, and gentleness that have attended my attempts to promote religion and virtue, and this when I have reason to hope I had real assistance from above and some sweet intercourse of heaven. But alas, what corrupt mixtures attended my best duties, unquote. The next 7 days, his gloom and distress continued for the most part, but he had some turns of relief and spiritual comfort. He gives an account of his spending part of his time in hard labor to build himself a little cottage to live in amongst the Indians, in which he might be by himself, having, it seems, hitherto lived with a poor Scotsman, as he observes in the letter just now given. And afterwards, before his own house was habitable, he lived in a wigwam among the Indians. May 18th. Quote, my circumstances are such that I have no comfort of any kind, but what I have in God. I live in the most lonesome wilderness. Have but one single person to converse with that can speak English. Footnote. This person was Brainerd's interpreter, an ingenious young Indian belonging to Stockbridge, whose name was John, his last name spelled W-A-U-W-A-U-M-P-E-Q, U-U-N-N-A-U-N-L. He had been instructed in the Christian religion by Mr. Sargent, had lived with the Reverend Mr. Williams of Long Meadow, had been further instructed by him at the charge of Mr. Hollis of London, and understood both English and Indian very well, and wrote a good hand. End of the footnote. Most of the talk I hear is either Highland Scot or Indian. I have no fellow Christian to whom I may unbosom myself or lay open my spiritual sorrows, with whom I may take sweet counsel and conversation about heavenly things and join in social prayer. I live poorly with regard to the comforts of life. Most of my diet consists of boiled corn, hasty pudding, etc. I live on a bundle of straw. My labor is hard and extremely difficult, and I have little appearance of success to comfort me. The Indians have no land to live on, but what the Dutch people lay claim to, and these threaten to drive them off. They have no regard to the souls of the poor Indians, and by what I can learn, they hate me because I come to preach to them. But that which makes all my difficulties grievous to be borne is that God hides his face from me. May 19th. Spent most of this day in close study, but was sometimes so distressed that I could think of nothing but my spiritual blindness, ignorancy, pride, and misery. I have reason to make that prayer, quote, Lord, forgive my sins of youth and former trespasses, unquote. May 20th. Was much perplexed some part of the day, but towards night had some comfortable meditations on Isaiah 40, verse 1. Comfort ye, etc., and enjoyed some sweetness in prayer. Afterwards, my soul rose so far above the deep waters that I dared to rejoice in God. I saw that there was sufficient matter of consolation in the blessed God, unquote. The next 9 days, his burdens were, for the most part, alleviated, but with variety, at sometimes having considerable consolation, and at others being more depressed. The next day, Monday, May 30th, he sent out on a journey to New Jersey to consult the commissioners who employed him about the affairs of the mission. Footnote. Having his business with the commissioners now was to obtain orders from them to set up a school among the Indians at Ka-na-Unik, and that his interpreter might be appointed the schoolmaster, which was accordingly done. End of the footnote. He performed his journey thither in 4 days, and arrived at Mr. Burr's in Newark on Thursday. In great part of his journey, he was in the depths of melancholy, under distresses like those already mentioned. On Friday, he rode to Elizabethtown, and on Saturday to New York, and from thence on his way homewards as far as White Plains. There he spent the Sabbath, and had considerable degrees of divine consolation and assistance in public services. On Monday, he rode about 60 miles to New Haven. There he attempted a reconciliation with the faculty of the college, and spent this week in visiting his friends in those parts, and in his journey homewards till Saturday in a pretty comfortable frame of mind. On Saturday, in his way from Stockbridge to Ka-na-Unik, he was lost in the woods and lay all night in the open air, but happily found his way in the morning and came to his Indians on Lord's Day, June 12th, and had greater assistance in preaching among them than ever before since his first coming among them. From this time forward, he was the subject of various frames and exercises of mind. In the general, much after the same manner as hitherto, from his first coming to Kalna-Yumik, till he got into his own house, a little hut, which he made chiefly from his own hands by long and hard labor, which was near 7 weeks from this time. The great part of this time he was dejected and depressed with melancholy, sometimes extremely. His melancholy operated in like manner, as related in times past. How it was with him in those dark seasons he himself further describes in his diary on July 2nd in the following manner, quote, "My soul is and has for a long time been in a piteous condition, wading through a series of sorrows of various kinds. I have been so crushed down sometimes with a sense of my meanness and infinite unworthiness, that I have been ashamed that any, even the meanness of my fellow creatures, should so much as spend a thought about me, and have wished sometimes, while traveling amongst the thick brakes, to drop, as one of them, into everlasting oblivion. In this case, sometimes, I have almost resolved never again to see any of my acquaintances, and really thought I could not do it, and hold up my face, and have longed for the remotest region for a retreat from all my friends, that I might not be seen or heard of any more. Sometimes the consideration of my ignorancy has been a means of my great distress and anxiety, and especially my soul has been in anguish with fear, shame, and guilt that ever I had preached or had any thought that way. Sometimes my soul has been in distress on feeling some particular corruptions rise and swell like a mighty torrent, with present violence, having at the same time 10,000 former sins and follies presented to view, in all their blackness and aggravations. And these, while destitute of most of the conveniences of life, and I may say of all the pleasures of it, without a friend to communicate any of my sorrows to, and sometimes without any place of retirement where I may unburden my soul before God, which has greatly contributed to my distress. Of late, more especially, my great difficulty has been a sort of carelessness, a kind of regardless temper of mind, whence I have been disposed to indolency and trifling, and this temper of mind has constantly been attended with guilt and shame, so that sometimes I have been in a kind of horror to find myself so unlike the blessed God. I have thought I grew worse under all my trials, and nothing has cut and wounded my soul more than this. Oh, if I am one of God's chosen, as I trust through infinite grace I am, I find of a truth that the righteous are scarcely saved." Unquote. It is apparent that one main occasion of that distressing gloominess of mind, which he was so much exercised with at Kalna-Yumik, was reflection on his past errors and misguided zeal at college in the beginning of the late religious commotions. And therefore he repeated his endeavors this year for reconciliation with the governors of the college, whom he had at that time offended, although he had been at New Haven in June this year in an attempted reconciliation, as mentioned already. Yet at the beginning of July he made another journey thither, and renewed his attempt, but still in vain. Although he was much dejected most of the time of which I am now speaking, yet he had many intermissions of his melancholy, and some seasons of comfort, special tranquility, and resignation of mind, and frequent special assistance in public services, as appear in his diary. The manner of his relief from his sorrow, once in particular, is worthy to be mentioned in his own words. Quote, "July 25th. Had little or no resolution for a life of holiness. Was ready almost to renounce my hopes of living to God. And oh, how dark it looked to think of being unholy forever. This I could not endure. The cry of my soul was Psalms 65, verse 3. Iniquities prevail against me. But I was in some measure relieved by a comfortable meditation on God's eternity, that he never had a beginning. whence I was led to admire his greatness and power in such a manner that I stood still and praised the Lord for his own glories and perfections. Though I was, and if I should forever be, an unholy creature, my soul was comforted to apprehend an eternal, infinite, powerful, holy God. Unquote. Quote, July 30th. Just at night, moved into my own house and lodged there that night. Found it much better spending the time alone than in the wigwam where I was before. Lord's Day, July 31st. Felt more comfortably than some days past. Blessed be the Lord, who has now given me a place of retirement. Oh, that I may find God in it, and that he would dwell with me forever. August 1st. Was still busy in further labors on my house. Felt a little of the sweetness of religion, and thought that it was worthwhile to follow after God through 1,000 snares, deserts, and death itself. Oh, that I might always follow after holiness, that I may be fully conformed to God. Had some degree of sweetness in secret prayer, though I had much sorrow. August 2nd. Was still laboring to make myself more comfortable with regard to my house and lodging. Labored under spiritual anxiety. It seemed to me that I deserved to be thrust out of the world, yet found some comfort in committing my cause to God. It is good for me to be afflicted, that I may die wholly to this world and all that is in it. August 3rd. Spent most of the day in writing. Enjoyed some sense of religion. Through divine goodness, I am now uninterruptedly alone, and find my retirement comfortable. I have enjoyed more sense of divine things within a few days last past than for some time before. I longed after holiness, humility, and meekness. All that God would enable me to, quote, pass the time of my sojourning here in his fear, unquote, and always live to him. August 4th. Was unable to pray much through the whole day, and through divine goodness found some intenseness of soul in the duty, as I used to do, and some ability to persevere in my supplications. I had some apprehensions of divine things which afforded me courage and resolution. It is good, I find, to persevere in attempts to pray, if I cannot pray with perseverance, i.e., continue long in my addresses to the divine being. I have generally found that the more I do in secret prayer, the more I have delighted to do, and have enjoyed more of a spirit of prayer, and frequently have found the contrary, when, with journeying or otherwise, I have been much deprived of retirement, a seasonable steady performance of secret duties in their proper hours, and a careful improvement of all time, filling up every hour with some profitable labor, either of heart, head, or hands, are excellent means of spiritual peace and boldness before God. Christ, indeed, is our peace, and by him we have boldness of access to God. But a good conscience, void of offense, is an excellent preparation for an approach into the divine presence. There is a difference between self-confidence or a self-righteous pleasing of ourselves, as with our own duties, attainments, and spiritual enjoyments, of which good men are sometimes guilty, and that holy confidency, arising from the testimony of a good conscience, which good Hezekiah had when he says, quote, Remember, O Lord, I beseech thee, how I have walked before thee in truth, and with a perfect heart, unquote. Then, says the holy Psalmist, shall I not be ashamed when I have respect to all thy commandments. Filling up our time with and for God is the way to rise up and lay down in peace, unquote. The next 8 days he continued for the most part in a very comfortable frame, having his mind fixed and sweetly engaged in religion, and more than once blesses God, that he had given him a little cottage where he might live alone and enjoy a happy retirement, free from noise and disturbance, and could at any hour of the day lay aside all studies and spend time in lifting up his soul to God for spiritual blessings. August 13th, quote, was enabled in secret prayer to raise my soul to God with desire and delight. It was indeed a blessed season. I found the comfort of being a Christian, and counted the sufferings of the present life not worthy to be compared with the glory of the divine enjoyments even in this world. All my past sorrows seemed kindly to disappear, and I, quote, remembered no more the sorrowful joy, unquote. Oh, how kindly and with what a filial tenderness the soul confides in the Rock of Ages at such a season that he will, quote, never leave it nor forsake it, unquote, that he will cause, quote, all things to work together for good, unquote. I longed that others should know how good a God the Lord is. My soul was full of tenderness and love, even to the most invenerated of my enemies. I earnestly desired that they should share in the same mercy, and loved that God should do just as he pleased with me and everything else. I felt particularly serious, calm, and peaceful, and encouraged to press after holiness as long as I live, whatever difficulties and trials may be in my way. May the Lord always help me to do. Amen and amen. Lord's Day, August 14th. I had much more freedom in public than in private. God enabled me to speak with some feeling sense of divine things, but perceived no considerable effort. August 15th. Spent most of the day in labor to procure something to keep my horse on in the winter. Enjoyed not much sweetness in the morning, was very weak in body through the day, and thought that this frail body would soon drop into the dust, and had some very realizing apprehensions of a speedy entrance into another world. In this weak state of body, I was not a little distressed for want of suitable food. I had no bread, nor could I get any. I am forced to go or send 10 or 15 miles for all the bread I eat, and sometimes it is moldy and sour before I eat it, if I get any considerable quantity. And then again, I have none for some days together, for want of an opportunity to send for it, and cannot find my horse in the woods to go myself. And this was my case now. But through divine goodness, I had some Indian meal, of which I made little cakes and fried them. Yet, I felt contented with my circumstances, and sweetly resigned to God. In prayer, I enjoyed great freedom, and blessed God as much for my present circumstances as if I had been a king, and thought that I found a disposition to be contented in any circumstances. Blessed be God, unquote. The rest of this week he was exceedingly weak in body, and much exercised with pain, yet obliged from day to day to labor hard to procure fodder for his horse. Except some part of the time, he was so very ill that he was neither able to work nor study, but speaks of longings after holiness and perfect conformity to God. He complains of enjoying but little of God, yet he says that little was better to him than all the world besides. In his diary for Saturday, he says, he was somewhat melancholy and sorrowful in mind, and adds, I never felt comfortably, but when I find my soul going forth after God, if I cannot be holy, I must necessarily be miserable forever, unquote. Quote, Lord's Day, August 21st, was much straitened in the forenoon exercise. My thoughts seemed to be all scattered to the ends of the earth. At noon, I fell down before the Lord, groaned under my vileness, barrenness, and deadness, and felt as if I was guilty of soul murder in speaking to immortal souls in such a manner as I had then done. In the afternoon, God was pleased to give me some assistance, and I was enabled to set before my hearers the nature and necessity of true repentancy. Afterwards had some small degree of thankfulness, was very ill and full of pain in the evening, and my soul mourned that I had spent so much time to so little profit. August 22nd. Spent most of the day in study and found my bodily strength in a measure restored. Had some intense and passionate breathings of soul after holiness and very clear manifestations of my utter inability to procure or work it in myself. It is wholly owing to the power of God. Oh, with what tenderness the love and desire of holiness fills the soul. I wanted to wean out of myself to God, or rather to get a conformity to Him. But alas, I cannot add to my stature and grace 1 cubit. However, my soul can never leave striving for it, or at least groaning, that it cannot strive for it and obtain more purity of heart. At night, I spent some time in instructing my poor people, know that God would pity their souls. August 23rd. Studied in the forenoon and enjoyed some freedom. In the afternoon, labored abroad, endeavored to pray, but found not much sweetness or intenseness of mind. Towards night was very weary and tired of this world of sorrow. The thoughts of death and immortality appeared very desirable and even refreshed my soul. Those lines turned to my mind with pleasure. Quote, "Come, death, shake hands. I'll kiss thy bands. 'Tis happiness for me to die. What? Dost thou think that I will shrink? I'll go to immortality." Unquote. In evening prayer, God was pleased to draw near my soul, though very sinful and unworthy, so that I was enabled to wrestle with God and so persevere in my request for grace. I poured out my soul for all the world, friends and enemies. My soul was concerned, not so much for souls as such, but rather for Christ's kingdom, that it might appear in the world, that God might be known to be God in the whole earth. And all my soul abhorred the very thought of a party in religion. Let the truth of God appear, wherever it is, and God have the glory forever. Amen. This was indeed a comfortable season. I thought I had some small taste of, and real relish for the enjoyment and employments of the upper world. Oh, that my soul was more attempered to it. August 24th. Spent some time in the morning in study and prayer. Afterwards was engaged in some necessary business abroad. Towards night, found a little time for some peculiar studies. And I thought if God should say, quote, "Cease making any provisions for this life, for you shall in a few days go out of time into eternity," unquote, my soul would leap for joy, all that I may both, quote, "desire to be dissolved to be with Christ," unquote, and likewise, quote, "wait patiently all the days of my appointed time till my change come," unquote. But alas, I am very unfit for the business and blessedness of heaven. Oh, for more holiness. August 25th. Part of the day was engaged in studies and part in labor abroad. I find it is impossible to enjoy peace and tranquility of mind without a careful improvement of time. This is really an imitation of God and Christ Jesus, quote, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work," unquote, says our Lord. But still, if we would be like God, we must see that we fill up our time for Him. I daily long to dwell in perfect light and love. In the meantime, my soul mourns that I make so little progress in grace and preparation for the world of blessedness. I see and know that I am a very barren tree in God's vineyard, and that He might justly say, "Cut it down," etc. Oh, that God would make me more lively and vigorous in grace for His own glory. Amen. The 2 next days he was much engaged in the necessity labors, in which he extremely spent himself. He seems these days to have had a great sense of the vanity of the world, continued longings after holiness, and more fervency of spirit in the service of God. Lord's Day, August 28th, quote, "Was much perplexed with some irreligious Dutchmen. All the discourse turned upon the things of the world, which was no small exercise to my mind. Oh, what a hell it would be to spend an eternity with such men. Well might David say, quote, 'I beheld the transgressors, and was grieved,' unquote. But adorned be God. Heaven is a place into which no unclean thing enters. Oh, I long for the holiness of that world. Lord, prepare me for it," unquote. The next day he set out on a journey to New York, was somewhat dejected the first 2 days of his journey, but yet seems to have enjoyed some degrees of the sensible presence of God. Quote, August 31st, rode down to Bethlehem, was in a sweet, serious, and I hope Christian frame when I came there. Eternal things engrossed all my thoughts, and I longed to be in the world of spirits. Oh, how happy it is to have all thoughts swallowed up in that world, to feel oneself a serious, considerate stranger in this world, diligently seeking a road through it, the best, the sure road to the heavenly Jerusalem. September 1st, rode to Danbury, was more dull and dejected in spirit than yesterday. Indeed, I always feel comfortably when God realizes death and the things of another world to my mind. Whenever my mind is taken off from the things of this world and set on God, my soul is then at rest," unquote. He went forward on his journey and came to New York on the next Monday. And after tarrying there 2 or 3 days, he set out from that city towards New Haven, intending to be there at the commencement, and on Friday came to Horseneck. In the meantime, he complains much of dullness and want of fever in religion, but yet from time to time speaks of his enjoying spiritual warmth and sweetness in conversation with Christian friends and assistants in public services. Quote, September 10th, rode 6 miles to Stanwich and preached to a considerable assembly of people. Had some assistance and freedom, especially towards the close. Endeavored much afterwards in private conversation to establish holiness, humility, meekness, etc., as the essence of true religion, and to moderate some noisy sort of persons who appeared to me to be actuated by unseen spiritual pride. Alas, into what extremes men incline to run. Returned to Horseneck and felt some seriousness and sweet solemnity in the evening. Lord's Day, September the 11th. In the afternoon, I preached from Titus 3, verse 8. This is a faithful saying, and these things, etc. I think God never helped me more in painting true religion and in detecting clearly and tenderly discountenancing false appearances of religion, wild fire, party zeal, spiritual pride, etc., as well as a confident dogmatic spirit and its spring, viz., ignorance of the heart. In the evening, took much pains in private conversations to suppress some confusions which I perceived were among these people. September 12th, rode to Mr. Mills at Ripton, had some perplexing hours, but was some part of the day very comfortable. It is, quote, through great trials, unquote, I see, quote, that we must enter the gates of paradise, unquote. If my soul could but be holy, that God might not be dishonored, methinks I could bear sorrows. September 13th, rode to New Haven, was sometimes dejected, not in the sweet flame, lodged at name not given. Had some profitable Christian conversation. I found that my inward trials went great, and a life of solitude gives them greater advantage to settle and penetrate to the very innermost recesses of the soul. Yet it is better to be alone than encumbered with noise and tumult. I find it very difficult maintaining any sense of divine things while removing from place to place, diverted with new objects and filled with care of business. A settled, steady business is best adapted to a life of strict religion. September 14th. This day I ought to have taken my degree. Footnote. This being commencement day. End of footnote. But God sees fit to deny it me. And though I was greatly afraid of being overwhelmed with perplexity and confusion when I should see my classmates take theirs, yet at the very time God enabled me with calmness and resignation to say, quote, the will of the Lord be done, unquote. Indeed, through divine goodness, I have scarcely felt my mind so calm, sedate, and comfortable for some time. I have long feared this season and expected my humility, meekness, patience, and resignation would be much tried. Footnote. His trial was the greater in that, had it not been for the displeasure of the governors of the college, he would not only on that day have shared with his classmates in the public honors which they then received, but would on that occasion have appeared at the head of that class, which if he had been with them, would have been the most numerous of any that ever had been graduated at that college. End of the footnote. But found much more pleasure and divine comfort than I expected. Felt spiritually serious, tender, and affectionate in private prayer with a dear Christian friend today. September 15th. Had some satisfaction in hearing the minister's discourse. It is always a comfort to me to hear religion and spiritual conversation. All that ministers and people were more spiritual and devoted to God. Towards night, with the advice of Christian friends, I offered the following reflections in writing. to the rector and trustees of the college, which are for substance the same that I had freely offered to the rector before, and entreated him to accept, that, if possible, I might cut off all occasion of offense from those who seek occasion. What I offer is as follows, quote, whereas I have said before several persons concerning Mr. Whittlesey, one of the tutors of Yale College, that I did not believe he had any more grace than the chair I then leaned upon, I humbly confess that herein I have sinned against God and acted contrary to the rules of his word and have injured Mr. Whittlesey. I had no right to make thus free with his character, and had no just reason to say as I did concerning him. My fault herein was the more aggravated in that I said this concerning one who was so much my superior, and one when I was obliged to treat with special respect and honor, by reason of the relation I stood in to him in the college. Such a manner of behavior, I confess, did not become a Christian. It was taking too much upon me, and did not savor of that humble respect which I ought to have expressed towards Mr. Whittlesey. I have long since been convinced of the falseness of those apprehensions by which I then justified such a conduct. I have often reflected on this act with grief. I hope on account of the sin of it, and am willing to lie low and be abased before God and man for it. I humbly ask the forgiveness of the governors of the college and of the whole society, but of Mr. Whittlesey in particular. And whereas I have been accused by one person of saying concerning the Reverend rector of Yale College that I wondered he did not expect to drop dead for finding the scholars that followed Mr. Tenton to Milford, I seriously profess that I do not remember my saying anything to this purpose, but if I did, which I am not certain that I did not, I utterly condemn it and detest all such kind of behavior, and especially in an undergraduate towards the rector. And I now appear to judge and condemn myself for going once to the separate meeting in New Haven, a little before I was expelled, though the rector had refused to give me leave. For this I humbly ask the rector's forgiveness, and whether the governors of the college shall ever see cause to remove the academic censure I lie under or no, or to admit me to the privileges I desire, yet I am willing to appear, if they think fit, openly to own and to humble myself for these things I have herein confessed, unquote. God has made me willing to do anything that I can do, consistent with truth for the sake of peace, and that I might not be a stumbling block for others. For this reason I can cheerfully forego and give up what I verily believe, after the most mature and impartial search, is my right in some instances. God has given me the disposition that if a man has done me 100 injuries, and I, though ever so much provoked to it, have done him only one, I feel disposed and heartily, willingly, humbly, to confess my fault to him, and on my knees to ask forgiveness of him, though at the same time he should justify himself in all the injuries he had done to me, and should only make use of my humble confession to blacken my character the more, and represent me as the only person guilty. Yea, though he should, as it were, insult me and say he knew all this before, and that I was making work for repentancy. Though what I said concerning Mr. Whittlesey was only spoken in private to a friend or two, and being partly overheard, was related to the rector, and by him extorted from my friends. Yet, seeing it was divulged and made public, I was willing to confess my fault therein publicly, but I trust God will plead my cause, unquote. I was witness to the very Christian spirit which Brainerd showed at that time, being then at New Haven, and one whom he thought fit to consult on that occasion. This was my first opportunity of a personal acquaintance with him. There truly appeared in him a great degree of calmness and humility, without the least appearance of rising of spirit for any ill treatment which he supposed he had suffered, or the least backwardness to abase himself before them who, as he thought, had wronged him. What he did was without any objection or appearance of reluctancy, even in private, to his friends, to whom he freely opened himself. Earnest application was made on his behalf to the authority of the college that he might have his degree then given him, and particularly by the Reverend Mr. Burr of Newark, one of the correspondents of the Honourable Society in Scotland, he being sent from New Jersey to New Haven by the rest of the commissioners for that end, and many arguments were used, but without success. Indeed, the governors of the college were so far satisfied with the reflections which Brainerd had made of himself that they appeared willing to admit him again into college, but not to give him his degree, till he should have remained there at least 12 months, which being contrary to what the correspondents to whom he was now engaged had declared to be their mind, he did not consent to it. He desired his degree, as he thought it would tend to his being more extensively useful. But still, when he was denied it, he manifested no disappointment or resentment. The next day, he went to Derby, then to Southbury, where he spent the Sabbath and speaks of spiritual comfort, but complains much of unfixedness and wanderings of mind in religion. Quote, September 19th, in the afternoon, rode to Bethlehem, and there preached. Had some measure of assistance, both in prayer and preaching. I felt serious, kind, and tender towards all mankind, and longed that holiness might flourish more on earth. September 20th. Had thoughts of going forward on my journey to my Indians, but towards night was taken with a hard pain in my teeth, and shivering cold, and could not possibly recover a comfortable degree of warmth the whole night following. I continued very full of pain all night, and in the morning had a very hard fever and pains almost over all my whole body. I had a sense of the divine goodness in appointing this to be the place of my sickness among my friends who were very kind to me. I should probably have perished if I had first got home to my own house in the wilderness, where I have none to converse with but the poor, rude, ignorant Indians. Here, I saw, was mercy in the midst of affliction. I continued thus, mostly confined to my bed till Friday night, very full of pain most of the time, but through divine goodness, not afraid of death. Then the extreme folly of those appeared to me, who put off their turning to God till a sick bed. Surely this is not a time proper to prepare for eternity. On Friday evening, my pains went off somewhat suddenly. I was exceedingly weak and almost fainted, but was very comfortable the night following. These words, Psalms 118, verse 17, I shall not die but live, etc., I frequently revolved in my mind, and thought we were to prize the continuation of life only on this account, that we may, quote, show forth God's goodness and works of grace, unquote. From this time, he gradually recovered, and the next Tuesday was so well as to be able to go forward on his journey homewards, but it was not till the Tuesday following that he reached Clonmacnoise. He seems great part of this time to have had a very deep and lively sense of the vanity and emptiness of all things here below, and of the reality, nearness, and vast importance of eternal things. Quote, this is the end of Chapter 5, Part 1 of 3. Chapter 5 is so long, we're breaking it up into 3 parts. This is the end of Part 1.